Hello, and welcome back to the True Tolkien channel, where we compare and contrast what Mr. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote in his immense works, The Silmarillion, The Lord of the Rings, and many others, to the absolute bullocks being spooned out by Mr. Payne and Mr. McKay in Amazon's Rings of Power. This is Scroll 5, in which we will combine episodes 6, 7, and 8 and take a look at where our intrepid writers have taken us now on their journey, the one they're creating that has nothing to do with J.R.R. Tolkien's work practically in Middle Earth. My name's Kent McNall. Now you may be asking, why am I combining episodes 6, 7, and 8 into a single scroll where I have had a one-to-one correlation in the past? When I saw the end of episode 6, I pretty much almost gave it up because I felt that the level of ridiculosity had gotten so high that it really, really wasn't worth it anymore. The reviews of Rings of Power are terrible, even though Amazon is doing their level best to shovel a bunch of crap that says, oh, the reviews are all good. I don't know what the heck they're looking at. Any review I've found on YouTube, especially by knowledgeable Tolkien fans, they all feel the same way I feel about the entire series. But I think it is still a worthwhile cause to try to get you all to read the works of J.R.R. Tolkien so that you know what a fantastic story it is, what an immense world he created, and how, with his personal effort and later that of his son Christopher Tolkien, he protected that world by being meticulous in every aspect of it. Mr. Tolkien really did not publish a lot of the work that he created. Much of the work he created was the backstory of the Fellowship of the Ring, which was his masterpiece. But really, the far greater story is told in his earlier works, like the Silmarillion. And that covers the first age. And then there's the second age, and the third age. At the very end of the third age is where we find the Lord of the Rings, which I've talked about many times before. So the writers of the Rings of Power are pretty much stomping the heck out of the second age. They apparently can't do that much with the first age by the rights agreed to with the Tolkien family, but they can certainly muddle and screw up the second age, and they're very, very, very busy doing that. Professor J.R.R. Tolkien is an absolute giant in the world of fiction, and especially in the world of fantasy. He practically invented the genre. He kicked off generations of fantasy writers who all wanted to be just like him and who all wanted to write trilogies just like him. And the number of works is uncountable that have been created because of Professor Tolkien's work. He's looked up to by everyone who ever wanted to write fantasy and even science fiction. And he did that because he meticulously, over an entire lifetime, created the fantasy world, not just of Middle Earth, but of Arda, of the world, that is far greater, far larger than Middle Earth, with a history spanning millions of years, and a meaningful history spanning tens of thousands of years. And he did it with a dedication to meticulous quality, inventing, reinventing, writing, and rewriting every part of his story. And he was so cautious and careful that he just didn't have time in his lifetime to finish the work to his level of quality that he expected, of perfection. And thankfully, as I've talked about many times before, his son Christopher was willing to share that with the world, but as his father wrote it, not as he rewrote it or reimagined it. And that's why we have such a rich library of work by Professor Tolkien and edited and released by his son Christopher to enjoy. And that's where the stories of the First Age and the Second Age are coming from, because Mr. Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, never really released any of that work. And that's why the intellectual property that Professor Tolkien created is so incredibly valuable. Far, far, far more valuable even than the public knows that Amazon has paid for it, because they didn't get all the rights to all the work. Thankfully, they didn't get all the rights to all the work. But it still begs the question, why would someone pay the kind of money that Jeff Bezos paid for the rights to Professor Tolkien's work and the right to create stories about the Second Age, and then let hack writers like Payne and McKay and producers destroy the value of that intellectual property with their careless, sitcom-style, ridiculous muddling of everything about the stories, the characters, the motivations, the timeline, the story itself, the events. Why would somebody do that? Well, I can only give you one off the top answer. As I write these episodes of these scrolls to put on YouTube, Mr. Bezos is worth something like $144 billion. And that's after he gave half his money to his ex. That means that he can spend $1 billion as easily as the average American family can spend $2,000, probably more easily. Why else would you do this? Does he have something against J.R.R. Tolkien's work? Because they're destroying the story so badly that I don't even know how they're going to interface to the Third Age, which is already well documented and already has many movies that have been released about it, much less how somebody else might interface to them who's creating stories of the First Age, which I dearly, dearly hope will happen and will have great quality. So I'm combining a review of episodes 6, 7, and 8, not only because the ridiculosity is off the charts, but also because they're just not worth individual TrueTolkien scrolls. So we're going to go through a review of each of the shows one by one and talk about the revelations therein and the ridiculosity thereof. And we'll start with episode 6, which is called Udun. Episode 6 kicks off with Adar preparing his troops for the long-awaited battle at the fortress in what amounts to Mordor. And he gives them a rousing speech. And fairly quickly, we switch to the Númenóreans, who are now on their way to Middle-earth. And there's a couple of conversations on deck between, Galadriel and this character and that character, but Elendil and the Queen discuss where they're going, and where they're going is, in fact, Udun, which is a part of Mordor, as you can pretty clearly see from what the Queen is looking at. So basically, this 3-ship, pretty small sailing fleet from Númenor is heading to Middle-earth, going to go up the Anduin River and go out to what will later become Mordor to do what in one particular village? Well, to carry out the errand of Halbrand, basically. So we're still wondering about Halbrand. Who is Halbrand? And that's the only reason that they're doing this. They have no other specific goal in mind. They're just taking this random trip to Middle Earth to go to this random little village and try to save it. Meanwhile, back at said fortress, Arondir is trying to destroy the little gadget that nobody knows what it is, but he knows it needs to be destroyed, and he figures out he can't do that. So he knows that the bad guys are coming, and sure enough, they are. In a scene reminiscent of Helm's Deep, the torches come over the horizon, and at long last, the long-awaited battle is joined. But strangely enough, even though they seem to be vastly outnumbered, the villagers actually carry the day. But again, Arondir makes the discovery that, oops, they sent in our neighbors, that we're traitors, and that's who we've been killing all night. Well, right about the time they figure that out, guess what? Here comes the actual orcs to finish them off. But fortunately, guess what? Yep, the Numenorians come riding in, and I'll tell you what, folks, hate to tell you this, but you can't get that number of horses on those 3 ships. Good size though the ships may be, that's about 10 ships worth of horses, I'd say. Galadriel and Halbrand have some special time together in which she gives him the old, oh yes, I felt it too. But fortunately, Halbrand is ready to take on the mantle of the king of the Southlands. And as the villagers are eating and enjoying their victory, he's presented with this, do you accept your role as the king of the Southlands? Yes, I do. Wow, that's awesome, because your entire qualifications are meeting up with Galadriel on a boat in the middle of the ocean. And that's pretty much about it. That's Nobody knows anything else about you, but you're now the king of the Southlands. That's awesome. Congratulations. Unfortunately, Arondir and the boy under the cupboard discover that the tool of doom that they've had possession of is no longer in their possession. Someone has cleverly replaced it with an axe. And as they're all celebrating, the tool of doom is being used to basically create a volcano. It's creating Mount Doom. It's someone has cleverly engineered this so that the water will go in and hit the lava, and we all know what happens when lava hits water. Volcano is created. And in potentially the most ridiculous scene I've ever seen, all the people who just won their battle are hit with a huge pyroclastic cloud, lava bombs and all. And Galadriel takes one right in the smacker, right in the face. Boom, right in the gob. Galadriel gets hit with a pyroclastic cloud. Now, folks, a pyroclastic cloud is nothing to trifle with. You don't survive getting hit in the face with a pyroclastic cloud. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're an elf, a man, a dwarf, a Balrog. You are all done when you get hit with a pyroclastic cloud. But these clever writers, these wonderful writers who have taken on this mission to recreate what Professor Tolkien worked his entire life to create, they have figured out that yes, you can survive a pyroclastic cloud. And that will lead us into the beginning of episode 7. Now, I want to just take a moment here and tell you that these events took place over thousands of years, but Professor Tolkien did not write thousands of years worth of narrative. He wrote a story, wrote a timeline. He detailed many of the large events that happened in the Second Age, but he did not write out the details of day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year life. And it's perfectly reasonable to expect that people telling a story about the Second Age would fill in some of those details, but they wouldn't rewrite everything about it. And that's the beef here, that they have rewritten everything about it. But also that so many of the scenes that they have created in season 1 are simply outlandishly ridiculous. It is ridiculous to think that Galadriel jumped in the middle of the ocean and somehow got back and survived that. And not only did she survive it, but she found a bunch of other little boats out in the middle of the ocean where they had no business being. It's ridiculous to think that all these people could get hit in the face with a pyroclastic cloud from a volcano and survive it. And that is one of the major reasons that I feel Mr. Basil should start over, quite frankly. We'll get to that at the end here. At the end of the scroll, we'll talk about what Mr. Bezos should do about the Rings of Power. As we move into episode 7, it's about 7 seconds later than episode 6 ended. And we come upon Galadriel, who is ridiculously unhurt for having just been hit in the face with 5,000 degrees worth of pyroclastic cloud. A little disoriented, I guess, but you can expect that. The entire town is basically gone, in flames, incinerated, in ash, but her hair isn't even singed. There's a horse that runs by with his back on fire. That's a cool scene. And as we move into the scenes, we see several things happen. She encounters Theo, grabs him, says, "Let's go." Comes upon a scene where Isildur is gone, buried under the tavern, and his buddy is dead right there. And basically, it's just unaccountable how they would think that you could have a volcano go off in everybody's face and everybody's not dead and buried under 10 feet of ash, but that's the way the writers operate here, I guess. Before long, we're with Elendil, who is kind of watching the line of survivors that are heading out of town go by. And fairly soon, he encounters the queen and the kid that he made what I thought was a lieutenant, but he soon refers to as a captain. And we can all tell there's something wrong with the queen. Number one, her face is incredibly dirty. But number two, every member of the audience knows she's blind. You can just tell from looking at her and the way she's acting that she's blind. But Elendil pretty quickly asks the captain, "Where's my son?" And then he says it again, "Where's my son?" And that's the extent of his efforts to locate Isildur. The way they played it out so far is his eldest son, because Anarion is not only not in the story, but he's not even in the credits at all. So either he's going to come along later, or they are doing something majorly stupid with Elendil's sons, because they do have Valandil in here. They just don't have Anarion. They get a bit further up the trail, and Elendil finally catches on that the queen can't see because she asks, "Is this smoke going to clear?" And makes it a little unclear whether the queen was even aware that she was blind, but you got to believe that she was. And so the queen has the idea, hey, nobody needs to know. So again, she's going to, deceive people into believing that she can't see, that she can see when she can't. Well, she gets over that idea just not too far down the road. But Theo and Galadriel, even though they started in exactly the same place everyone else was and ran into the same people in the town, have somehow wandered off on their own. But that gives them the opportunity to get to know each other a little better. And they have a nice little not fireside chat in which Galadriel reveals that she was married. And her husband, Celeborn, she hasn't seen apparently for about 3,000 years since the end of the war. And the last time she saw him, she made fun of him because his armor didn't fit. And she also said that he discovered her dancing in a glade, which is basically how Beren discovered Luthien. Doesn't really translate to Celeborn and Galadriel, but that's what the writers wanted to borrow for this scene, I guess. The group soon arrives at a settlement where they have a little problem with a horse. And the horse situation kind of upsets Elendil, and he gets around to saying, "I wish I'd never picked up the elf out of the ocean." So his son dying didn't push him to that edge, but having to let the horse go did. Galadriel and Theo make it back to the same settlement, where Theo goes to the hospital and finds what he's worried is his mom, but his mom actually taps him on the shoulder. Okay, he's glad that they're back together. And then the little family is complete as he goes and gives Arondir a great big hug. And so they're apparently a unit now, a family, and that's heartwarming. Arondir also bows to the commander of the northern armies, of course, as Galadriel shows back up as well. Now, her meeting with Elendil and the Queen doesn't necessarily go quite as well, but the Queen does welcome her and does assure her that the enemies of Numenor are going to regret the day that they ever started this fight. The Queen has given up her charade that she's not blind, and she's obviously wearing a blindfold. At the end of the conversation on the cliff, the Queen asks Elendil for affirmation of what she's saying. She says, "Right, Elendil? Elendil? Elendil?" And he doesn't answer her. Significant breach there between the captain and the Queen. The Numenorians are going home with their tail between their legs. Their queen has been blinded, and they haven't accomplished very much except to do the bidding of the supposed king of the southern lands. Galadriel then finds out that they have actually located Halbrand and that he is sorely wounded. He was found on the road somewhere after the volcano incident. And she takes a look at him and declares he needs elven medicine to get better. So, of course, that starts with mounting up and pelting across the plains to find this elven medicine. So Halbrand, who was in his deathbed, jumps up and is now going for a nice long horsey ride. So that's where we'll leave the Numenorians and Galadriel after episode 7. We rejoin the Harfoots after a couple of episodes have gone by, and they're just about to reach the grove. So they're very, very happy until they reach the grove, because then they find that the grove has been not destroyed, but wounded, apparently by a big rock from a mountain down south, spewing fire. Hey, we know where that came from. So they're very upset, but they do their best to collect some of the fruit. But then Sadok gets the idea that, hey, maybe Meteor Man can help with this situation. So they get the Meteor Man to do his thing and talk to the trees and try to fix things up. And of course, Nori can't help but get herself in great big trouble. So when sure enough things don't go right and the tree limb almost kills Nori and her sister, guess what? Our friends are going to send the Meteor Man off. So Sadok points him on the road out to the east side of the Greenwood. So off he goes, and guess who's coming to dinner? The Stygian witches show back up. And of course, Nori does what Nori does. See, she gets right in the middle of it and makes it a whole lot worse. Except for this time, the Stygian witches actually destroy the homes of the Harfoots. So now, Sadok gets to send Nori on the road. But her whole family decides they are going to go with her. They're not going to leave her on their own. And then Sadok himself decides that he's going to go with them. So what we end up with is the stranger, Meteor Man, wandering off across the Greenwood, and in hot pursuit are our young Harfoot family and Sadok to go keep him company. That brings us to the season finale, episode 8. And in episode 8, everything's going to end up with a fairly nice ribbon around it that they started this season. And that may be part of the difficulty and the downfall of this series, is that they're trying to put neat bows and ribbons across a short term on a story that took centuries and thousands of years to unfold. And they're trying to stuff it all into a very, very short time frame, literally a tiny time frame, especially when you compare it to the life and existence of the elves, which this story is primarily about. By the end of episode 7, all of our major storylines have reached some kind of crisis point. The elves are going to perish within a matter of days if they don't have Mithril. The dwarves have already awakened the Balrog. The Meteor Man has been already cast out of his little society among the Harfoots. And Numenor is in a state of turmoil, and the queen has been blinded and is returning in basic shame to Numenor. And of course, our Daunty men that were living in what turns out to be Mordor, their home has been destroyed, Mount Doom has erupted, and they're cast to the winds. Our new friend Halbrand is now the king of men, but has been sorely wounded, so sorely that he has to go pelting across the plains on a horse with Galadriel to get some elven magic. The greatest mystery, who is Sauron, is about to be solved. Where have you placed your bet? My money's on Halbrand. The three main storylines that are covered in episode 8 have to do with the Harfoots and the Meteor Man, the elves, and not so much, but some about the Númenóreans. And I'm going to group them that way rather than try to bounce back and forth between the storylines. And we're going to start with the Harfoots and the Meteor Man. As you recall, in the end of episode 7, the stranger, or the Meteor Man, has been cast out from the Harfoots and is heading across the Greenwood. And that's where we pick up the story. He's basically not gone very far, but he pulls out his apple that Nori gave him and is, obviously probably contemplating her and eating it when he loses it. But, of course, he spots the Harfoots, who have so far not failed to get spotted every time they were hiding. And in that pursuit, he finds that Nori has indeed followed him. Whoa, that ain't Nori. And I think that's a really good look for her, however. And turns out the three bad ladies are, in fact, on his case. They start chatting him up, and one of them refers to him as Heru Sauron. And it's clear, mystery solved. The stranger, the Meteor Man, is Sauron. And these emissaries are basically sent to educate him and to bring him along in his reuniting with his consciousness. Now, in looking at who these three people might be, there were only a couple of possibilities that were consistent with Tolkien, which, in fact, this entire storyline is not. One of them is that the Meteor Man was some kind of rogue from Valinor, and that these three emissaries had been sent to try to retrieve him or destroy him or whatever. Their guise is fairly evil looking, yet also the kind of guise that elves would wear, or somebody from Valinor would wear. Now, of course, none of this is consistent with Tolkien's story, but at least that was mildly plausible. Now it has been revealed that the Meteor Man was in fact made to forget who he is. They're here to try to bring him back to himself. And the question is, where the heck are they from if not from Valinor? Because there is no other place for them to be from. There's no Valinor for the dark side. Melkor's gone. Morgoth is gone. Sauron is the big boss. And Sauron never went through any period of forgetfulness, nor did he ride in on a meteor. This has always been one of the biggest holes in this entire storyline. After several hours, they're in camp together, and the stranger pulls out his little map that he was given by the Harfoots and shows it to them. And they say, "Oh yeah, that's a common constellation, somebody's hat." Now, in this discussion sequence, they reveal that they want to take the stranger to Hrun, and that's where the stars are strange and where apparently they are from. That kind of sequence sets him off, and they have to kind of settle him down. Calm yourself, they say, and they're trying to get to the point where they can bring his consciousness back. But in the meantime, they decide he needs a little nap time, so they knock him out, and things proceed. Now, of course, the Harfoots are going to show up, and this is when they do. And with a usual Harfoot ill-formed plan, they decide to interfere. And quite a sequence, quite a fight ensues. And of course, it's completely in the dark. You can barely follow what's going on, or at least I can, especially with my bad eyesight. But Sadok is grievously wounded, and the stranger pops up looking pretty evil, looking pretty Sauron-like. The chief baddie charges in with her staff in a scene very, very reminiscent of Gandalf v. Saruman. Gets him floating up in the air, gives him a couple of rotations, couple of twists, just to, disorient him. She's not trying to kill him, but she is trying to subdue him. Just at the right moment, one of the baddies is stabbed in the foot, and general mayhem, of course, ensues. And things get real serious real quick. Fires everywhere, and the Harfoots are all about to get roasted. But there's time for this very nice little scene between Nori and the stranger in which he says, "You need to get out of here or I'm going to hurt you again." And she says, "No, you're not. You're good." And, of course, the stranger is now going to get a hold of one of the staffs. And in the nick of time, he is going to save the day and save the Harfoots, all except Sadok. But in the meantime, a very interesting revelation comes about as he calls the baddies out and returns them to the darkness from whence they came. What is this interesting revelation, you ask? Good question. As the stranger reveals himself to be good and is now wielding the power of the staff and has quenched their fire, they state, "It is not Sauron, it is the other. It is the Istar." Now, this is very, very revealing, and it's revealing in several ways. Number one, it reveals that, again, where are these people from? They're from some entity that is not Valinor, that is not the Valar, that really doesn't exist in Tolkien's world. It also reveals that they are unaware that Sauron is aware. In other words, Sauron has never been unaware. He's never been not conscious. And so where they got the idea that he needed help, who knows? It also reveals that they are aware of the Istar and that this is supposed to be one of the Istari, which is one of the 5 wizards that came from Valinor by ship and landed at the Havens and were met by one of the elves. So this is probably something I'm guessing the producers and writers haven't even thought of. They haven't even thought what a big, huge hole this is. They just did it as a contrivance for this first season because the implications of it are very, very broad. Now, perhaps they're just from Rhûn, and this is supposed to represent some other faction in Rhûn that has these godlike powers, but that's not Tolkien's story at all. And maybe it's just something that they're grabbing onto because they can basically do what they want if they invent something from Rhûn. There's just no writings related to it. The form that they all take as they are banished into the darkness is, of course, very derivative from the Nazgul scenes from The Lord of the Rings. And an interesting, possible comparison. But again, these beings are never, ever mentioned by Tolkien. There is no story that Tolkien tells of such creatures. When all is said and done with the fighting, unfortunately, poor Sadok is not going to make it. He's not going to pull through. And so there's a scene of them simply watching the sunrise as Sadok passes. In the final scenes for the season, involving the Harfoots and Elenor and the stranger, it's decided that the stranger is going to head east into Rhûn. And he talks to Nori about, he needs to share this adventure with someone. And she doesn't want to leave her people, but of course she is going to leave her people. And there are several scenes of lots of goodbyes, plenty of emotional scenarios, and she is, in fact, going to wander off with the stranger. The Harfoots have changed their leadership, of course, because Sadok is no longer with them. And it's hard for me to imagine their continuing role in the saga, but I imagine there will be one. But the bottom line is that the stranger and Nori are wandering off into the east. And they are going to the land of Rhûn, where nobody ever went in Tolkien's tale. Now, so where's the story heading as they head off into the east. Who is the stranger now that we know he is not Sauron? Well, it could, it can still be Gandalf, it could be Radagast, it could even be Saruman, but that, all those things are so totally inconsistent. The one thing that's floating around out there is the idea that he's one of the blue wizards, that one of the 5 Istari who came from Valinor, not on a meteor, but they went into the east and were really never heard of again. And that would at least give the producers and writers some runway to do something that's not going to damage the story as they have with so many other things. And in my own opinion, the Istari that went into the east, they went there for the purpose of keeping the east out of the wars of what we know as Middle Earth, even though the east is also Middle Earth. The east is a very interesting place. The Eldar were born there. Men came from there. It's a land of mystery. There's plenty of room for telling tales about the wizards out in the east, again, without hurting the main story. Here's one for you. How about if Nori grows up to be Goldberry, and that's Tom Bombadil? Wouldn't that be fun? So that's how we wrap up the Harfoots for the first season of The Rings of Power. Now that we know that Adar is not Sauron, and we know the stranger is not Sauron, that pretty much leaves, in my mind, one person, Halbrand. And I've been suspicious of him for quite some time, if you followed the series here. And now I'm quite certain that Halbrand is our man. There are a lot of clues of why it's Halbrand. Number one, Sauron is a great deceiver. And this guy has deceived everybody. They've accepted that he's some heir of kings with absolutely no evidence whatsoever. Number two, what was he doing floating around in the middle of the ocean? Just happened to be where Galadriel was and just happened to get to Numenor. Number three, he has got a lot of skill at the forge. And that was one of Sauron's strengths, is he was always wonderful at forging things. Number four, he's got Galadriel wrapped around his finger. And although Galadriel's character is nothing like what Tolkien wrote, it would be very inconsistent for her to be so easily be cowed and wrapped around someone's finger. And number five, somehow the mission that the Númenóreans are on, which they never went on, of course, in Tolkien's world, is in Mordor and has now resulted in the creation of Mount Doom. Halbrand is the one that sent them there. His story, his tale, his BS is the one that sent them there. Halbrand is Sauron. As we recall from episode 5, the elves are in great big trouble because they must have Mithril or they're going to perish, and they're going to have to leave Middle-earth and return to Valinor. So they have dispatched Elrond to bargain with the Dwarf King, and that's where we find Elrond in the middle of making a proposal to the Dwarf King that in exchange for all the Mithril they can get their hands on, they will provide food, game, grain, etc. to the dwarves for 500 years. And the Dwarf King is going to take this offer under advisement. There follows a very, very intense meeting between King Durin and his son Durin, in which the king advises younger Durin that the elves are on their way out. Their time is past. We're not going to help them. Durin then attacks his father, basically saying, any idea that doesn't come from you, you're not going to go for, and I'm tired of this stuff, and, you need to step aside, or whatever his argument basically is. And this doesn't end well at all for Durin, the younger, and off he goes. In relating the story to his wife, she gets very, very upset. She's, quite ambitious for her husband and for herself, and says, his time has come, and, you're the one that needs to take over. And at some point, they realize something, it's not really clear what happens with the Mithril that they have, but Durin calls for Elrond, and the next thing you know, Elrond and Durin are now personally mining for the Mithril. So Elrond is again involved in deception and sneaking around in Khazad-dûm. Well, they do actually discover the Mithril, the main lode of Mithril, in a huge cavern filled with Mithril. But the king discovers them, and that's a problem. Elrond finds himself again on the doorstep of Khazad-dûm, right where the Mithril doors will one day be created, because the elves and the dwarves are such good friends. And he has once again failed in his mission. The king is not tolerant of Durin's deception and actually takes his princedom away, passing it to Durin's brother. So all of this lying is really not paying off for anybody, but Durin the Younger is now not the heir of Khazad-dûm. In the final scene of the Dwarf Saga, the king is having the cavern that they discovered, covered up, but it's too late. And the falling leaf is burned up by what turns out to be the Balrog. So the producers and writers have already awakened the Balrog when only a very tiny amount of mithril has been mined. So have no idea what direction they're going to go with this part of the story, because there was tons of mithril mined over hundreds of years. We all remember Bilbo's mithril coat, but mithril is used in everything from one of the elven rings to many, many other things over a long period of time. I don't think the Balrog's going to stand by while they do a lot of mining. So we'll see how that one pans out. The Númenórean story kicks off with Tar Palantir, who is on his very last legs. And his counselor, Pharazôn, who's somebody you should keep an eye on, by the way, is meeting with a group of artists and saying that, we've got to get some art of our dear ruler before he passes. You're each going to have 1 hour with him. Pretty thin reason to even film a scene, frankly. But a young artist, I believe her name is Maya, is mistaken by the dying king for his daughter Muriel. And he goes off on a tangent with her and actually borrows a line, I believe, from Wormtongue back in the Lord of the Rings about he knows what she's been doing in the dead of night when she thinks nobody else knows. Apparently, she's been spending a lot of time with the Palantir. I'm very unclear why they even stepped off into this area, but the bottom line is that the king is dead. Long live the king. We then rejoin the Númenórean ship that's sailing back to Númenor from Middle-earth with Elendil and Queen Muriel and everybody who survived, which apparently is only one ship. They don't have any other ships in sight. And we rejoined the queen, who is apparently preparing again to try to deceive people to thinking that she can see. She's counting steps, which is something a blind person would absolutely do, even if they weren't trying to deceive anyone. She's trying to count the number of steps up the stairs, even though she's not on the stairs. So it's a very interesting scene. And her and Elendil get very close. It's interesting, the dynamic that might be growing up between those two, which absolutely should not be there if they're sticking at all to what Tolkien has written for us. They discuss nothing whatever of substance, but she does end up with her head on his shoulder. When they go back on deck, they are pulling into Númenor, and it's a very, very strange scene. I don't know what they were trying to convey with this scene, where there have been some changes in the Númenórean harbor, but you really can't tell what they're about. But the bottom line is the king is dead. And of course, the queen, who now has a blindfold on, can't see that. And she keeps asking Elendil, what's wrong? What do you see? What do you see? So there's not a whole lot that happens in the Númenórean part of the section of the story here, but it does end on Pharazôn. And again, we'll be keeping a pretty close eye on Pharazôn next year, because while his character is absolutely nothing like our Pharazôn the Golden in Tolkien's tale and in Akalabeth, that is who he is. By far, the most important aspect of Episode 8 is the tale of the elves, who face annihilation if they don't get the mithril that they need to keep themselves alive, and face immediately having to depart from Middle-earth. Now, as I've said before, this never happened and is a major departure from Tolkien's story. It is the effort of the producers and the writers to create imminent danger at all costs, even though the lives of the elves do not really involve that much imminent anything. They live for a long, long time, and they deal with their major problems over a long period of time. Little do they know that there's a new danger approaching in the form of Galadriel. And yes, she's back. Elrond and Lord Celebrimbor are discussing the fact that they have failed to come up with the mithril that they need, primarily because they're continually trying to deceive the dwarves and have been booted out, as you saw in episode 7 of Khazad-dûm. So they don't have the mithril that is imminently needed. They see Galadriel arrive, and of course she still has Halbrand in tow. Now, of course, we have to remember that the last thing Elrond knew about Galadriel, she'd been sent off to Valinor. So, big surprise for them. Halbrand, of course, was on his deathbed before he even left, and now he's ridden for 6 days straight. Doesn't, frankly, look like he's in that bad of shape. Kind of superhuman, don't you think? Galadriel and Elrond sit down and have a little chat, and Elrond makes the interesting statement that he sent her off to Valinor. I thought it was the king. At any rate, they mend fences, and, that will never happen again, he says. So Halbrand is direly in need of elven magic, and he's practically on his deathbed, but the very next thing we see is Halbrand wandering around in Celebrimbor's workshop. And they have a nice little chat, and Halbrand is a little grabby with mithril and other things that are laying around, like precious jewels. And pay attention to that. Pay attention to the fact that Halbrand is touching everything that they're going to be creating something very special with very soon. Well, Halbrand quickly makes a major contribution to Celebrimbor's thinking, because Celebrimbor is only supposed to be the greatest metallurgy specialist and forge specialist that the elves have, the grandson of Fëanor himself. But the supposed king of men is giving him advice on how to forge what he's trying to forge. And at one point, Celebrimbor thanks him for this wonderful advice, and he says, consider it a gift. There's even this very interesting close-up of Halbrand handing directly into Celebrimbor's hand some of the materials. A key scene follows in which Elrond, Lord Celebrimbor, and Galadriel attempt to convince King Gil-Galad to give them more time. But he says, time has run out. We've got to leave. You've got to get out of here. You need to shut the city down. We've got to leave Middle-earth. The problem that never existed is so dire now. This is also a key scene because Lord Celebrimbor reveals some words that Galadriel recognizes as having been spoke by Halbrand before. So, her suspicions are now roused about Halbrand. Elrond manages to get more time from the king, even though he runs afoul of the king's temper by saying, you owe me this. And the king says, no, you are owed nothing. And I think that's pretty much true, based on the level of deception that Elrond has been practicing to try to get what he wants. They then attempt to complete the task, and in doing so, Halbrand's participating, and of course, all of the Elven Smiths are participating, but they experience failure. But Halbrand has yet another idea of how they can overcome their problems. Galadriel somewhat confronts Halbrand, and that begins a very long sequence that is very revealing about the relationship between Halbrand and Galadriel and about the true nature of Halbrand himself. Galadriel has asked one of the elves to look up some records, which they would have no way of having, quite frankly. But the scroll, the papers that Halbrand gave her in Numenor, are the basis of this. And when she confronts Halbrand with this information, he turns into the deceiver and turns everything around on her, saying, "No, you're the one that did this. You're the one that wanted to leave Numenor. I wanted to stay in Numenor. I told you that I got these papers off a dead man." And basically, Galadriel was just hearing what she wanted to hear and creating what she wanted to create. But it very quickly becomes apparent that Halbrand is not who he has said he is. After Galadriel attempts to attack Halbrand, she finds herself once more in Valinor and with her brother, even though as an adult, not as a child. And her brother tells a story of Sauron being good and trying to find the good to heal Middle Earth. And of course, this leads her to know that Halbrand is in fact Sauron the Deceiver. There's a very confrontational scene that takes place on the boat that he picked her up in. And the scene on the boat is very suggestive, very intimate. There's one part where Halbrand is really handling her face in a very strange way. It's clear he's trying to betroth her or have her become his mate so that she can become the queen of dark power and help him in his efforts. And this is very reminiscent of her position in the Lord of the Rings when they're in Lothlorien, and she says, "You would create me as a terrible queen." This never happened. She did not have that kind of relationship with Sauron at all, and so they're really reaching with this particular scene. There is a fairly cool scene that most married people will recognize of pretty good shouting match between the two, however. When she awakens in Ostenethil, she challenges Elrond, because of course now she knows that Sauron can appear as anyone, and fairly flimsy, question for Elrond. But she then goes back to talk with Elrond and Celebrimbor and says, "You can't make two, you have to make three." And so they embark on another forging session using the suggestions made by Sauron himself, as we now know him to be, on how to make the three rings. Celebrimbor first asks her for her knife because they need the purest gold and silver from Valinor. Now, the Noldor would still have had plenty of pure gold and silver from Valinor, but it has to be her knife, apparently. I found the scenes of the forging to be very, very interesting. And of course, they put the mithril into the mix, even though in Tolkien's world, only one of the three rings was made of mithril. At some point, Elrond decides to take a break and goes down to the same location that Galadriel confronted Sauron. He gets a feeling, I think, and he just goes down and he finds the scroll that was provided by the elf to Galadriel, proving that Halbrand was not the descendant of the kings. He finds that scroll and he realizes what it means, and he heads back up to the forge. And boy, does he look some daggers at Galadriel. But the three rings have now been forged. And boy, they're monstrous rings, I have to say. But they have beautiful gems. The three rings, Vilya, Nenya, and Narya the Great. But Elrond is now completely suspicious of Galadriel and knows that, as usual, she is withholding information from them about Sauron, about the true nature. And why would she do that, by the way? Why would she withhold that information from them at such a critical juncture? You would think that having discovered Sauron, a being she's been looking for thousands of years, that she would have divulged that. Now, I said pay attention to how much interaction Sauron had with Celebrimbor and with the materials used to make the rings. And the reason I had you pay attention to that is because Tolkien specifically states and specifically writes that the 3 elven rings were the only ones never touched by Sauron. Well, it turns out that they were plenty touched by Sauron, so that totally breaks canon, and is important canon because it means that the 3 elven rings are tainted, and they were not tainted. Another aspect of the 3 rings is that the original holders of the 3 rings, which at least is hinted at its Galadriel, Celebrimbor, and Elrond, were actually Elrond, Galadriel, and Círdan. And Círdan has not even appeared in these tales yet, even though he is the most ancient of elves left in Middle-earth and oversees the havens from which the elves depart to Valinor. This is an important aspect that I don't know if they're going to try to correct. I have a feeling that they're not. One other thing to note, and it's along the lines of this continuing deception, everybody deceiving everybody, is that the king has been completely blocked out here. Now, even in Tolkien's tale, Gil-Galad never received one of the 3 rings. At least he does not write of it. And he was not one of the holders of the 3 rings at the time of his death. So, very interesting aspects of the forging of the 3 rings. This did not happen in a day or a week or however much time you might want to say actually went by during this process here in this part of this episode. Many years went by, and many other rings had already been forged before the 3 were forged. So this is, again, a very significant twisting of the tale. Last thing I'll say, when, who we now know to be Sauron, said to Celebrimbor, "Consider it a gift." Sauron went around for many years interacting with the elves, trying to win over the smiths of Eregion. This did not happen in days, it happened in years and years. And he was in a fair guise and known to be very generous. And he was not in a guise of a king of the Southlands. But he named himself Anatar, which means the Lord of Gifts. So that one little thing, considered a gift, is the only nod to that entire section of history that Tolkien wrote of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. In the final scene of Season 8, Halbrand/Sauron has now disappeared, but made his way back to Mordor, back to Mount Doom. And obviously, next season will probably be very significantly about the rebuilding of Barad-dûr and Sauron establishing his realm in Mordor. It seems hard to believe he'll keep his fair seeming as a man, but more than likely he will, the way that the producers and writers are handling this entire series. Please join me again in the near future for a complete recap of Season 1 and discussion of the major issues of Season 1 and the major areas in which the producers and writers have deviated so much from Tolkien's story as to be really a completely different story in a world they should have created themselves instead of ruining Tolkien's. But I'll talk more about that. We'll be back next season as well. And I promise with a little higher production values. Going to get some artwork done on Fiverr or something like that. So, thank you for joining us for this episode 6, 7, and 8 review. And I'll look forward to seeing you for the recap and beyond.